Okay. Culture wars. Wow. Tim Pool. The conflicts that rent Weimar were more than merely political or economic. Their visceral quality derived much from the fact that they were not just fought out in parliaments and elections, but permeated every aspect of life. Indifference to politics was hardly a characteristic of the German population in the years leading up to the Third Reich. People arguably suffered from an excess of political engagement and political commitment. One indication of this could be found in the extremely high turnout rates at elections, no less than 80% of the electorate in most contests. Elections met with none of the indifference that is allegedly the sign of a mature democracy. On the contrary, during election campaigns in many parts of Germany, every spare inch of outside walls and advertising columns seemed to be covered with posters, every window hung with banners, every building festooned with the colors of one political party or another. This went far beyond the sense of duty that was said by some to have driven voters to the polls in pre-war years. There seemed to be no area of society or politics that was immune from politicization. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the press. No fewer than 4,700 newspapers appeared in Germany in the year 1932, 70% of them on a daily basis. Many of them were local with a small circulation, but some of them, like the liberal Frankfurt newspaper, Frankfurter Zeitung, were major broadsheets with an international reputation. Such organs formed only a small part of the politically oriented press, which together made up about a quarter of all newspapers. Nearly 3/4 of the politically oriented papers owed their allegiance to the Center Party, or its equivalent in the South, the Bavarian People's Party, or to the Social Democrats. The political parties set great store by their daily papers. Vorwärts, for the Social Democrats and the Red Flag for the Communists were key parts of their respective parties' propaganda apparatus and headed up an elaborate structure of weekly magazines, local newspapers, glossy illustrated periodicals, and specialist publications. A newspaper propaganda organizer like the Communist press chief, Willy Munzenberg, could win an almost mythical reputation as a creator and manipulator of the media. At the opposite end of the political spectrum, an equally legendary status was occupied by Alfred Hugenberg, who, as chairman of the board of the arms manufacturer Krupp's, had purchased the Schurl newspaper firm in 1916. 2 years later, he also acquired a major news agency through which he supplied large sections of the press with stories and leading articles during the Weimar years. By the late 1920s, Hugenberg had in addition become owner of the mammoth film production company, the UFA. Hugenberg used his media empire to propagate his own virulently German nationalist ideas across the land and to spread the message that it was time for a restoration of the monarchy. Such was his reputation that by the end of the 1920s, he was being referred to as the uncrowned king of Germany and one of the most powerful men in the land. Yet, whatever people thought, media power of this kind did not translate directly into political power. Hugenberg's domination of the media had absolutely no effect in stopping the relentless decline of the nationalists after 1914. Political papers, in general, had small circulations. In 1929, for instance, the Red Flag sold 28,000 copies a day, Forwards 74,000 a day, and Hugenberg's The Day just over 70,000. These were not impressive figures by any stretch of the imagination. Moreover, sales of the Red Flag dropped to 15,000 just as the communist vote was beginning to increase in the early 1930s. Overall, the circulation of the overtly political press fell by nearly a third between 1925 and 1932. The upmarket, liberal quality dailies also lost circulation. The Frankfurt newspaper, probably the most prestigious of the liberal quality dailies, slipped from 100,000 in 1915 to 71,000 in 1928. As newspaper editors realized only too well, many readers of the pro-Weimar liberal press voted for parties that were opposed to Weimar. The political power of editors and proprietors seemed limited here, too. What was undermining the political press in the 1920s was, above all, the rise of the so-called boulevard papers, cheap, sensational tabloids that were sold on the streets, particularly in the afternoons and evenings, rather than depending on regular subscribers. Heavily illustrated with massive coverage of sport, cinema, local news, crime, scandal, and sensation, these papers placed the emphasis on entertainment rather than information. Yet they, too, could have a political orientation, like Hugenberg's Night Edition, whose circulation grew from 38,000 in 1925 to 202,000 in 1930, or Musenberg's World in the Evening, Welt am Abend, which boosted its sales from 12,000 in 1925 to 220,000 in 1930. By and large, the pro-Weimar press found it hard to keep up with such competition, though the liberal-oriented Ulstein press empire did produce the successful Tempo, 145,000 in 1930, and BZ at Midday, BZ am Mittag, 175,000 in the same year. The Social Democrats were unable to compete in this market. It was at this level that the politics of the press had a real impact. Scandal sheets undermined the Republic with their sensational exposure of real or imagined financial wrongdoings on the part of pro-Republic politicians. Illustrations could convey the contrast with imperial days. The massive publicity the popular press gave to murder trials and police investigations created the impression of a society drowning in a wave of violent crime. Out of the provinces, ostensibly unpolitical local papers, often fed by right-wing press agencies, had a similar, if more muted, effect. Hugenberg's press empire might not have saved the nationalists from decline, but its constant harping on the inequities of the Republic was another factor in weakening Weimar's legitimacy and convincing people that something else was needed in its stead. In the end, therefore, the press did have some effect in swaying the minds of voters, above all in influencing them in a general way against Weimar democracy. The emergence of the sensationalist popular press was only one among many new and, for some people, disquieting developments on the media and cultural scene in the 1920s and early 1930s. Experimental literature, the concrete poetry of the Dadaists, the modernist novels of Alfred Dublin, the social critical plays of Bertolt Brecht, the biting polemical journalism of Kurt Tucholsky, and Karl von Ossietzky, all divided readers between a minority who rose to the challenge of the new and the majority who regarded such work as cultural Bolshevism. Alongside the vibrant, radical literary culture of Berlin, there was another literary world, appealing to the conservative nationalist part of the middle class, rooted in nostalgia for the lost Bismarckian past and prophesizing its return with the longed-for collapse of the Weimar Republic. Particularly popular was Oswald Spengler's The Fall of the West, which divided human history into natural cycles of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and located early 20th century Germany in the winter phase, characterized by tendencies of an irreligious and unmetaphysical urban cosmopolitanism in which art had suffered a preponderance of foreign art forms. In politics, according to Spengler, winter was recognizable by the rule of the inorganic, cosmopolitan masses and the collapse of established state forms. Spengler won many adherents with his claim that this heralded the beginning of an imminent transition to a new spring that would be agricultural intuitive, and ruled by an organic structure of political existence, leading to the mighty creations of an awakening, dream-laden soul. Other writers gave the coming period of revival a new name that was soon to be taken up with enthusiasm by the radical right, the Third Reich. This concept was popularized by the neoconservative writer Arthur Müller van den Bruck, whose book of this title was published in 1923. The ideal of the Reich had arisen, he proclaimed, with Charlemagne and been resurrected under Bismarck. It was the opposite of the government by party that characterized the Weimar Republic. At present, he wrote, the Third Reich was a dream. It would require a nationalist revolution to make it reality. The political parties that divided Germany would then be swept away. When the Third Reich finally came, it would encompass all political and social groupings in a national revival. It would restore the continuity of German history, recreating its medieval glory. It would be the final Reich of all. Other writers, such as the jurist Edgar Young, took up the concept and advocated a conservative revolution that would bring about the Third Reich in the near future. Below this level of somewhat rarefied abstraction were many other writers who, in one way or another, glorified the alleged virtues that, in their view, the Weimar Republic negated. The ex-army officer Ernst Jünger propagated the myth of 1914, and in his popular book, Storm of Steel, exalted the image of the frontline troops who had found their true being only in the exercise of violence and the suffering and inflicting of pain. The Free Corps spawned a whole canon of novels celebrating the veterans' hatred of revolutionaries, often expressed in blood-curdling terms, portraying murder and mayhem as the ultimate expression of a resentful masculinity in search of revenge for the collapse of 1918 and the coming of revolution and democracy. In place of the feeble compromises of parliamentary democracy, authors such as these and many others proclaimed the need for strong leadership, ruthless, uncompromising, hard, willing to strike down the enemies of the nation without compunction. Others looked back to an idyllic rural world in which the complexities and decadence of modern urban life were wholly absent, as in Adolf Bartel's novel, The Dithmarshers, which had sold over 200,000 copies by 1928. All of this expressed a widespread sense of cultural crisis, and not just among conservative elites. Of course, many aspects of modernist culture and the media had already been in evidence before the war. Avant-garde art had impinged on the public consciousness with the work of expressionists such as Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, August Macke, or Emil Noldi, and abstract painters such as the Russian-born but Munich-based Vasily Kandinsky, atonal and expressionist music was emanating from the Second Viennese School of Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, and Zemlinsky, while sexually explicit drama in the form of plays, such as Spring's Awakening by Frank Wedekind, had already caused a major furor. Good one. There had been constant disputes under the Wilhelmine Reich about the limits of propriety in literature and the threat posed by allegedly unpatriotic and subversive or pornographic and immoral books, many of which were subject to bans imposed by the police. The sense of cultural crisis, which the emergence of modernist art and culture generated amongst the middle classes after the turn of the century, was held in check under the Wilhelmine regime, and in its more extreme forms remained confined to a small minority. After 1918, however, became far more widespread. The ending, or at least the scaling down, of the censorship that had been so harsh during the war and always active during the Wilhelmine period, encouraged the media to venture into areas that had previously been taboo. The theater became the vehicle for radical experimentation and left-wing agitprop. Cheaper reproduction and printing techniques made it easier to publish inexpensive illustrated papers and magazines for the mass market. Controversy swirled in particular around Weimar's Bauhaus, created by the architect Walter Gropius, oh no, in a merger of the Weimar Art Academy and the Weimar School of Arts and Crafts. An educational center that sought to join high art with practical design. Its staff included Vasily Kandinsky, Oskar Schlemmer, Paul Klee, Theo van Doesburg, Laszlo Moholy, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Jesus. Its bohemian students, both male and female, were unpopular with the townspeople, and its radically simple, clean, and ultra-modern designs were condemned by local politicians as owing more to the art forms of primitive races than to anything German. State funding was withdrawn in 1924, and the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, but it continued to be dogged by controversy, especially under its new director, Hans Meyer, whose communist sympathies led in 1930 to his replacement by the architect Mies van der Rohe. Fuck me! No more names! Mies expelled the communist students and replaced the Bauhaus's earlier communitarian ethos with a more structured, even authoritarian regime. But the Nazi majority elected to the town council in November of 1931 closed it down following an official inspection by Paul Scholz-Namberg, the ultra-conservative author of a book on art and race. It then moved to a factory site in Berlin, but from this time on was no more than a shadow of its former self. The fate of the Bauhaus illustrated how difficult it was for avant-garde culture to receive official acceptance even in the culturally relaxed atmosphere of the Weimar Republic. New means of communication added to the sense of old cultural values under threat. Radio first began to make a real mark as a popular cultural institution during this period. 1 million listeners had registered by 1926 and another 3 million by 1932, and the airwaves were open to a wide variety of opinion, including the left. Cinemas had already opened in the larger towns before 1914, and by the late 1920s, films were attracting mass audiences, which increased still further with the coming of the talkies at the end of the decade. Talkies? What is that? Talking movies? Yikes. I forget that the author's British sometimes. A sense of aesthetic disorientation was prompted amongst many cultural conservatives by expressionist films such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, with its famously odd-angled sets, and by erotically charged movies like Pandora's Box, starring the American actress Louise Brooks. Louis Brooks? A sharp satire on bourgeois convention, such as The Blue Angel, based on a book by Heinrich Mann and starring Emil Jannings and Marlene Dietrich, ran into trouble with its production company, Hugenberg's UFA, not least for its portrayal of the cynical and manipulative eroticism of its central female character. The film of Eric Maria Remarque's novel All Quiet on the Western Front aroused a furious campaign on the part of ultranationalists who thought its pacifist message unpatriotic. Bourgeois culture had held up bland ideals of beauty, spiritual elevation, and artistic purity that seemed mocked by the manifestations of Dada, while the new objectivity, literally new matter-of-factness, placed everyday events and objects at the center in an attempt to aestheticize modern urban life. This was not to everyone's taste. Instead of losing themselves in portentous thoughts inspired by the mythical world of Wagner's Ring Cycle, or the ritual religious music drama of Parsifal, dress-suited bourgeois opera-goers were now confronted with the Kroll Opera's production of Paul Hindemith's News of the Day, in which a naked diva sang an aria sitting in a bathtub. Alongside the mellifluous late Romanticism of Germany's leading establishment composer, Richard Strauss, formerly an enfant terrible, but now the composer of slight and emotionally undemanding operas such as Intermezzo and the Egyptian Helena? Audiences were now treated with Alban Berg's expressionist masterpiece, Wozzeck, set among the poor and downtrodden of the early 19th century and incorporating atonal music and everyday speech patterns. The conservative composer Hans Pfitzner struck a chord when he denounced such tendencies as symptoms of national degeneracy and ascribed them to Jewish influences and cultural Bolshevism. The German musical tradition, he thundered, had to be protected from such threats, which were made more acute by the Prussian government's appointment in 1925 of the Austrian Jewish atonalist Arnold Schoenberg to teach composition at the State Music Academy in Berlin. Musical life was central to bourgeois identity in Germany, more probably than in any other European country. Such development struck at its very core. An even greater threat, in this view, was posed by the American influence of jazz, which found its way into works such as the Threepenny Opera, with music by Kurt Weill and lyrics by Bertolt Brecht. A caustic denunciation of exploitation set in a world of thieves and criminals, it sent shockwaves through the cultural world on its first performance in 1928. A similar effect was produced by Ernst Krenek's Johnny Strikes Up, which was premiered in February of 1927 and featured a black musician as its protagonist. Many modernist composers found jazz a stimulus to renewing their art. It was, of course, principally a popular art form, played in various styles at myriad nightclubs and bars, above all in Berlin, shading off into dance halls, revue theaters, and hotels. Visiting big bands and chorus lines, such as the Tiller Girls, enlivened the Berlin scene, while the more daring could spend an evening at a club such as the El Dorado, a supermarket of eroticism, as the popular composer Friedrich Hollander called it, and watch Anita Berber perform pornographic dances with names such as cocaine and morphium to an audience liberally sprinkled with transvestites and homosexuals until her early death in 1928 from drug abuse. Cabaret shows added to all this an element of biting, anti-authoritarian political satire and aroused pompous conservatives to anger with their jokes about the nationalist and religious sentiments and practices of Christians and Germans, as one of them angrily complained. The wrath of conventional moralists was aroused by dances such as the tango, the foxtrot, and the charleston, while racist rhetoric was directed against black musicians, though there were very few of them, and most were employed mainly as drummers or dancers, to lend a flavor of the exotic to the performance. The leading music critic, Alfred Einstein, called jazz the most disgusting treason against all Occidental civilized music, while Hans Pfitzner, in a vitriolic attack on the Frankfurt Conservatory for including jazz on its curriculum, railed against its supposed primitivism as a product of what he called blood, the musical expression of Americanism. Sorry, my voice cracked there. Jazz and swing seemed to be the crest of a wave of cultural Americanization in which such widely differing phenomenon as Charlie Chaplin films and the modern industrial methods of Fordism and Taylorism were viewed by some as a threat to Germany's supposedly historic identity. Mass production held out the prospect of mass consumption, with the great department stores offering an astonishing variety of international goods, while foreign-owned chain stores such as Woolworth's put at least some of them within the grasp of the ordinary working-class family. Mass housing schemes and designs for modern living challenged the conservative ideal of folk-based style and aroused fierce debate. For cultural critics on the right, the influence of America, symbol par excellence of modernity, signified a pressing need to resurrect the German way of living, German traditions, German ties to blood and soil. Older Germans in particular felt alienated, not least by the new atmosphere of cultural and sexual freedom that followed the end of official censorship and police controls in 1918 and was epitomized for many by the nightclubs of Berlin. One army officer, born in 1878, later recalled, "Returning home, we no longer found an honest German people, but a mob stirred up by its lowest instincts. Whatever virtues were once found among the Germans seemed to have sunk once and for all into the muddy flood. Promiscuity, shamelessness, and corruption ruled supreme. German women seemed to have forgotten their German ways. German men seemed to have forgotten their sense of honor and honesty. Jewish writers and the Jewish press could go to town with impunity, dragging everything into the dirt." The feeling that order and discipline had been swept away by the revolution and that moral and sexual degeneracy were taking over society was to be found on the left as well as on the right. Social democrats and communists often took a rather puritanical view of personal relationships, putting political commitment and self-sacrifice above personal fulfillment, and many were shocked by the openly hedonistic culture of many young people in Berlin and elsewhere during the Roaring Twenties. The commercialization of leisure in the cinema, the tabloid leisure. It could be pronounced both ways, right? The commercialization of leisure in the cinema, the tabloid press, the dance hall, and the radio was alienating many young people from the sterner, more traditional values of labor movement culture. The sexual freedom evidently enjoyed by the young in the big cities was a particular source of disapproval in the older generation. Here, too, there had been harbingers before the war. Harbingers, right? The rise of a large and vociferous feminist movement had accustomed the public and the press to women speaking out on all kinds of issues to the detriment of everyone. I'm just kidding. Occupying at least some positions of responsibility and making their own way in the world. On International Proletarian Women's Day, the 8th of March, the bigger cities saw annual demonstrations in the streets for women's suffrage from 1910 onwards, with even middle-class feminists staging a procession, albeit in carriages, in 1912. Alongside the eventually successful campaign for female suffrage came, if only from a minority of feminists, demands for sexual fulfillment, equal rights for unmarried mothers, and the provision of free contraceptive advice. The ideas of Freud, with their tendency to ascribe sexual motives to human actions and desires, were already being discussed before the war. Berlin, in particular, as it grew rapidly to the size and status of a cosmopolitan metropolis, had already become the center for a variety of social and sexual subcultures, including a thriving gay and lesbian scene. Critics linked these trends to what they saw as the looming decline of the family, caused principally by the growing economic independence of women. The rapid emergence of a service sector in the economy, with its new employment possibilities for women, from sales positions in the great department stores to secretarial work in the booming office world, driven by the powerful feminizing influence of the typewriter, created new forms of exploitation, but also gave increasing numbers of young, unmarried women a financial and social independence they had not enjoyed before. This became even more marked after 1918, when there were 11.5 million women at work, making up 36% of the working population. Although this was by no means a dramatic change from the situation before the war, many of them were now in publicly conspicuous jobs, such as tram conducting, serving in department stores, or, even if it was only a handful, in the legal, university, and medical professions. Increased female competition for male jobs and a more general fear among nationalists that Germany's strength was being sapped by the birth rate decline that set in around the turn of the century merged with wider cultural anxieties to produce a backlash that was already becoming evident before 1914. There was a discernible crisis of masculinity in Germany before the war as nationalists and pan-Germanists began to clamor for women's return to home and family in order to fulfill their destiny of producing and educating more children for the nation. The sharpness of the reaction to the feminist challenge meant that the feminists were forced onto the defensive, began to marginalize their more radical supporters, and increasingly stressed their impeccably nationalist credentials and their desire not to go too far with their demands for change. After 1918, women were enfranchised and able to vote and stand for election at every level from local councils up to the Reichstag. They were formally given the right to enter the major professions, and the part they played in public life was far more prominent than it had been before the war. Correspondingly, the hostility of those male supremacists who believed that women's place was in the home now won a much wider hearing. Their disapproval was reinforced by the far more open display of sexuality than before the war in the liberated atmosphere of the big cities. Even more shocking to conservatives was the public campaigning for gay rights by individuals such as Magnus Hirschfeld, founder of the harmless-sounding Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897. In fact, Hirschfeld was openly homosexual and in numerous publications propagated the controversial idea that homosexuals were a third sex whose orientation was the product of congenital rather than environmental factors. His committee was dedicated to the abolition of paragraph 175 of the Reich Criminal Code, which outlawed indecent activity between adult males. What aroused the wrath of conservatives was the fact that in 1919, the Social Democratic state government of Prussia gave Hirschfeld a large grant to convert his informal committee into a state-funded institute for sexual science, with its premise in the Grand Tiergarten district in the center of the capital city. The institute offered sex counseling, held popular question and answer sessions on topics like what is the best way to have sex without making a baby, and campaigned for the reform of all the laws regulating sexual behavior. Hirschfeld quickly built up a wide range of international contacts organized in the World League for Sexual Reform, of which his institute was the effective headquarters in the 1920s. He was the driving force behind the spread of public and private birth control and sex counseling clinics of the Weimar Republic. Not surprisingly, he was repeatedly vilified by the nationalists and the Nazis, whose attempts to tighten up the law still further, with the support of the Center Party, was narrowly defeated by the votes of the Communists, Social Democrats, and Democrats on the Criminal Law Reform Committee of the Reichstag in 1929. Nationalist hostility was driven by more than crude moral conservatism. Germany had lost 2 million men in the war, and yet the birth rate was still in rapid decline. Between 1900 and 1925, live births per 1,000 married women under the age of 45 fell very sharply indeed, from 280 to 146. Laws restricting the sale of condoms were eased in 1927, and by the early 1930s, there were more than 1,600 vending machines in public places, with one Berlin firm alone producing 25 million condoms a year. Sex counseling centers were open, offering contraceptive advice, and many of these, like Hirschfeld's Institute, were funded or, in some cases, actually operated by the Prussian and other regional governments to the outrage of moral conservatives. Abortion was far more controversial, not least because of the serious medical risks it entailed, but here too the law was relaxed, and the offense reduced in 1927 from a felony to a misdemeanor. The thundering denunciation of birth control by the papal encyclical Casti Connubii in December of 1930 added fuel to the flames of debate, and in 1931, some 1,500 rallies and demonstrations were held in a massive communist campaign against the evils of backstreet abortions. To many people, such campaigns seemed part of a deliberate plot to destroy the fertility and fecundity of the German race.
Fecundity.
Fecundity. The ability to produce an abundance of offspring. To many people, such campaigns seemed part of a deliberate plot to destroy the fertility and fecundity of the German race. Was it not, conservatives and radical nationalists asked, all the consequence of female emancipation and the morally subversive advocacy of sexuality untrammeled by any desire to procreate? To nationalists, the feminists seemed to be little better than national traitors for encouraging women to work outside the home. Yet the feminists themselves were scarcely less alarmed by the new atmosphere of sexual liberation. Many of them had castigated the double standard of sexual morality, freedom for men, purity for women, before the war, and advocated instead a single standard of sexual restraint for both sexes. Their Puritanism, expressed in campaigns against pornographic books and sexually explicit films and paintings, and in denunciations of young women who preferred dance halls to reading groups, seemed ridiculous to many women amongst the younger generation, and by the late 1920s, the traditional feminist organizations, already deprived of their principal cause by the achievement of female suffrage, were complaining of an aging membership and a failing appeal to the young. Feminism was on the defensive, and the middle-class women, who were the mainstay of its support, were deserting their traditional liberal milieu for parties of the right. The feminist movement felt the need to defend itself against charges of undermining the German race by insisting on its support for nationalist revision of the Treaty of Versailles for nationalist revision of the Treaty of Versailles for rearmament and for family values and for sexual self-restraint. As time was to show, the appeal of right-wing extremism to women proved no less potent than it was to men. Young people, and especially adolescent boys, were already developing a distinctive cultural style of their own before the First World War. A key role in this was played by the youth movement, a disparate but rapidly growing collection of informal clubs and societies that focused on activities such as hiking, communing with nature, right? And singing folk songs and patriotic verses while sitting around campfires. Of course, all the political parties attempted to recruit young people, particularly after 1918, by providing them with their own organizations, the Bismarck Youth for the Nationalists, for example, or the Windthorst League for the Center Party. But what was striking about the youth movement in general was its independence from formal political institutions, often combined with a contempt for what its leading figures saw as the moral compromises and dishonesties of adult political life. The movement fostered a distrust of modern culture, city life, and formal political institutions. Many, if not most youth groups, wore paramilitary uniforms along the lines of the Boy Scouts and were more than tinged with anti-Semitism, often refusing to admit Jews to their ranks. Some underlined the need for moral purity and rejected smoking, drinking, or liaisons with girls. Others, as we have seen, were male supremacists. Even if the responsibility of the youth movement for paving the way for Nazism has been exaggerated by historians, the overwhelming majority of the independent youth organizations were still hostile to the Republic and its politicians, nationalist in outlook and militaristic in character and aspirations. The influence of the youth movement, which was at its strongest in the Protestant middle class, was scarcely countered by the impact of the educational system on young Germans. The whole lot of high school pupils are nationalistic, reported Victor Klemper in 1925. They learn it thus from the teachers. The situation was perhaps a little more complicated than he imagined. Under the Wilhelmine Reich, the Kaiser's personal influence was exercised in favor of displacing liberal traditions of German education based on classical models with patriotic lessons focusing on German history and the German language. By 1914, many teachers were nationalist, conservative, and monarchist in outlook, while textbooks and lessons pursued very much the same kind of political line. But a sizable minority also held to a variety of opinions on the liberal center and left. In the 1920s, moreover, states dominated by the Social Democrats, notably Prussia, made strenuous efforts to persuade the schools to educate their pupils as model citizens loyal to the new republic's democratic institutions, and the atmosphere in the school system changed accordingly. Millions of young people emerged from their schooling as convinced communists or social democrats, or gave their allegiance to the center party, besides the other millions who adhered to conservative views or the politics of the radical right. In the end, neither those teachers who were liberal or social democratic, nor those who were conservative and monarchist, seem to have exercised much influence on the political views of their pupils, and many of their political ideas were dismissed by their charges as lacking in any relevance to what they perceived as the daily realities of life under the Weimar Republic. For young men who subsequently became Nazis, the beginnings of political commitment often lay more in political rebellion against the rigidities of the school system than in the inspiration of Nazi or proto-Nazi teachers. One nationalist school student, born in 1908, remembered that he was always clashing with his teachers because from childhood, I have hated slavish submissiveness. He admitted being politicized by a nationalist teacher, but commented at the same time that his idol's teaching formed a strong contrast to everything else that was taught in school. Another nursed a long-term grudge against his former school, which had repeatedly punished him for insulting Jewish fellow students. Where the political allegiance of the young to the far right was at its most obvious was in Germany's universities, many of them famous centers of learning with traditions going back to the Middle Ages. Some leftist professors did manage to secure appointments under the Weimar Republic, but they were few in number. Universities were still elite institutions after the war and drew almost all their students from the middle classes. Particularly powerful were the student dueling corps, conservative, monarchist, and nationalist to a man. Some of them played an active role in the violence that attended the suppression of the revolutionary outbreaks that took place in 1919 to 1921. To neutralize their influence, students in all universities established democratic representative institutions of a sort appropriate to the new republic early in 1919, the General Student Unions. All students had to belong to these and were entitled to vote for representatives on their governing bodies. Hold on, I need a drink of water. 1 second. Wow. I'm hungry. Okay. What are we reading? The title is literally at the top of my screen.